Rain fell in slow. Cold drops from the rusted roofs above, each drop hitting the dirty ground with a quiet splash. The alley smelled of damp metal and rotting trash, a place no one stayed in unless they had nowhere else to go. A thin, alien girl sat against the wall, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her head buried so no one could see her face. Her skin was covered in layers of filth, streaks of mud and dried stains running down her arms. The rags she wore hung loosely from her thin body, offering almost no warmth against the night air. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, the kind of shiver that came from shame around her. The city was alive. Neon lights flashing in the distance, shadows of people moving past the mouth of the alley. They glanced in, saw her, and quickly turned away. Some whispered to each other, their voices sharp and full of disgust. "Unclean," one muttered, pulling his coat tighter. "Stay away from her," another said to his friend, his tone like he was warning about a disease. The girl heard them, every word cutting into her like a blade, but she stayed silent. It was easier to pretend she didn't exist than to try to explain who she was or why she was here. Her name was Lyra, though she hadn't heard anyone call her that in a long time. She had been many things in her short life: servant, worker, burden, but never someone's friend. Now she was nothing at all. Just another piece of trash left in the corner of the world. Her stomach growled, the sound loud in the quiet of the alley. She hugged her knees tighter, wishing she could disappear into the bricks behind her. The rain grew heavier, cold drops slipping through the holes in the broken canopy above. She closed her eyes and tried to remember warmth, but the memory was faint, like something from another lifetime. Then she heard its footsteps. They were different from the others she had heard all night, not quick and dismissive like the city people. These steps were slow, steady, heavy, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who wasn't afraid of this place. Her heart sped up. She knew what happened when strangers came too close. People spat, people threw things, people laughed at her. She hid her face deeper in her knees, hoping whoever it was would just pass by. But the steps didn't stop. They came closer and closer still, until she could feel the presence of someone standing in front of her. The air seemed to change, the sound of the rain fading under the weight of the silence between them. Lyra dared to lift her head just a little. What she saw made her freeze. A tall human man, his clothes worn but clean, his eyes steady and unafraid. He looked at her, not with disgust or pity, but with something she hadn't seen in years. Concerned, before she could say anything, he took off his coat, a thick, warm one, and draped it over her shoulders. The sudden heat shocked her body. The coat smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Her hands gripped it tightly, like she feared it might vanish if she let go. "You're safe now," the man said, his voice calm and certain. She didn't believe him. How could she? But the way he said it made her want to. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, like it had forgotten how to speak. Behind him, she noticed movement. Two people had stopped to watch, their faces twisted in confusion. One of them whispered, "Why is a human helping her?" The other shook his head, muttering, "He's making a mistake." The man ignored them completely. He crouched down so they were eye level, his voice low so only she could hear. "Can you stand?" he asked. Lyra hesitated, her legs weak and shaky. But she nodded. When he helped her up, the world tilted for a moment. She had grown so used to the ground that standing felt strange. He held her steady, his hand firm but gentle. Every step she took felt like it might be her last before collapsing. The alley seemed longer on the way out. She could feel dozens of eyes on them, some curious, some hostile. A few people muttered insults under their breath. She expected him to let go of her hand, to walk away and save himself from their stares. But he didn't. He walked beside, Her like she belonged there, and for the first time in years, Lyra wondered if maybe, just maybe, she did. As they reached the street, the rain slowed. The neon lights painting the wet ground in colors. Lyra's mind was full of questions. Who was this man? Why was he helping her? But the loudest thought was something she couldn't push away. She had been invisible for so long, and now someone had finally seen her. And she didn't know if that was a blessing or a danger. Asterisk, the street was alive with voices, footsteps, and the hum of market stalls. Bright lights from shop windows spilled onto the wet pavement. But the brightness could not hide the dark looks people gave them. Lyra walked beside Daniel, the human man who had taken her from the alley. Her steps still. Unsteady, the coat he had wrapped around her was too big. The sleeves hanging past her hands, but she clutched it close like a shield. Everywhere they went, eyes followed. Some glances were quick, as if people didn't want to be caught looking. Others were long and sharp, full of something colder than the rain. Why is he touching her? A voice hissed from somewhere behind. She's one of them, another muttered. The words dripping with disdain. Lyra kept her gaze on the ground, the shame pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Daniel heard them too, but his grip on her shoulder didn't loosen. He guided her forward, moving at a steady pace. There was no hurry in his step, no fear in his posture. It was as if the whispers didn't exist, or maybe as if they didn't matter. But to Lyra, they mattered. Each word was like a reminder. Carved into her skin, she had been told since she was young that her kind were less, that they should never walk beside humans. And now, here she was, being led through the main street like she belonged. The thought made her both afraid and confused. Man selling fruit at a stand leaned forward as they passed, his eyes narrowing. "Hey human," he called out to Daniel. "You're making a mistake bringing that filth here." Daniel stopped, turning his head just enough to meet the man's glare. His voice was calm but carried weight. "She's with me," the fruit seller scoffed, muttering something under his breath before turning away. Lyra's fingers tightened around the edge of the coat. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground, but Daniel kept walking. It was like he was daring the world to challenge him. When they turned into a quieter street, the noise of the market faded, replaced by the distant sound of rain hitting metal gutters. Daniel slowed his pace, glancing at her. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softer now. For a moment, Lyra hesitated. Her name felt strange on her tongue. "Lyra," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the air between them. Daniel nodded, as if he had been expecting something simple. "All right. Lyra, you're going to be okay," he said. She almost laughed at the idea. She had never been okay, not for as long as she could remember. They stopped outside a small building with faded paint and an old wooden door. A dim lantern hung above the entrance, swaying gently with the wind. Daniel opened the door and led her inside. The warmth of the room hit her immediately, the air thick with the smell of cooked food and burning wood. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered innkeeper with gray hair and tired eyes. The man's expression changed the moment he saw Lyra. "What is that doing here?" he asked sharply. "She's a guest," Daniel replied without hesitation. Placing coins on the counter, the innkeeper looked from the money to Lyra and back to Daniel, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Regulations say her kind sleeps outside," the man said coldly. Daniel slid another coin forward. "Regulations can be bent." The silence stretched for a long moment before the innkeeper finally snatched up the coins and handed Daniel a key. "Top floor, last room," he muttered. Still glaring at Lyra, Daniel didn't bother thanking him, just took the key and motioned for her to follow. The stairs creaked under their weight as they climbed. Lyra kept her head low, feeling the innkeeper's eyes on her until they turned the corner. When they reached the door, Daniel unlocked it and stepped inside first. The room was small, but Clean a narrow bed, a wooden table, a basin, and a small heater in the corner. This is for you tonight, Daniel said, stepping aside so she could enter. Lyra lingered at the doorway, unsure if she should. It had been so long since she had been allowed inside any place meant for comfort, when she finally stepped in. Her bare feet felt strange against the warm wooden floor. Daniel set his pack down and pointed to the basin. There's warm water. There you can wash. Take your time. She froze, looking at the basin like it was something foreign. The towel he handed her was soft. Almost too soft for her rough skin. She clutched it tightly, a lump forming in her throat. I'll wait. Outside, Daniel said, walking to the door. So you have privacy. Lyra blinked at him. No one had ever said those words to her before, for a moment. She thought about speaking, about asking him why he was doing this, but the words got stuck, and she just nodded. When the door closed, she stood in the middle of the room, the coat still on her shoulders. She could still hear the whispers in her head, the contempt in the voices of the people outside. But here, in this small, quiet space, there was no one to glare at her, no one to spit near her. Feet, only the sound of water waiting to wash away the filth, and maybe the smallest part of her hoped, the shame. The door clicked shut behind Daniel, leaving Lyra alone in the small room for a long time. She just stood there, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The silence felt strange, not the silence of fear, but of safety. It was a feeling. She didn't trust yet, but it was there. Her eyes scanned the room slowly. The narrow bed looked too soft for her, as if it would sink under her weight and swallow her whole. The wooden table had no cracks, no stains, nothing broken. The little heater in the corner gave off a steady warmth that reached her bare feet. It had been years since warmth had touched her. Without burning, she turned toward the basin. The steam rising from it seemed unreal. The last time she had washed in warm water was before her life had changed, before the work camps. Before the chains, her fingers trembled as she reached for the towel. It was white, clean, and smelled faintly of soap. She could not remember the last time she had touched something clean. With slow movements, she took off the coat and placed it carefully on the bed. It felt wrong to let it go, but she knew she couldn't bathe while wearing it. She untied the strips of cloth that barely counted as clothes. Each layer revealed more of what she had tried to hide. Old scars, thin lines across her arms, deeper marks along her back, bruises that had not yet faded, dark against her pale skin. Her reflection in the small mirror above the basin made her heart tighten. The person staring back was not the girl she used to be. She dipped her hands into the water. The heat shocked her at first, making her gasp. Then it sank into her skin. Easing the stiffness in her fingers, she splashed some on her face. Watching the dirt run off in dark streaks, it felt like pieces of her old life sliding away as she washed. The water in the basin turned murky. Her skin felt lighter without the weight of dust and grime, but the marks beneath the scars, the bruises, they stayed. Those would not wash away so easily. Her mind drifted to the last time she had been touched with kindness. She couldn't remember when it was, or if it had even happened at all. She wrapped herself in the towel and stood there for a moment. Listening outside the room, she could hear faint sounds, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards. Daniel's voice talking to someone downstairs. She wondered what he was telling them. Was he defending her? Or was he explaining why he had brought her here? The idea of him defending her made her chest feel strange. When she was done, she put on the shirt Daniel had left for her. It was far too big, the sleeves nearly covering her hands. The fabric was soft and warm against her skin. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't shivering. A knock came at the door. Gentle, not like the pounding of boots she had known before. "It's me," Daniel's voice called. She opened the door slightly, enough to see him standing there with a small tray. On it was bread, steaming soup, and a cup of water. He stepped inside, placing the tray on the table. "You look better," he said, his tone careful. Lyra looked down, unsure if that was true, but the warmth in his voice made her want to believe it. He motioned to the food. "Eat before it gets cold." She sat at the table, picking up the bread first. The crust was crisp, the inside soft. She took a bite and had to stop herself from eating too fast. The soup was thick, filled with vegetables and small pieces of meat. Each spoonful sent warmth spreading through her body. Daniel sat across from her, watching quietly. He didn't ask questions at first, letting her eat in peace. When she slowed, he finally spoke. "Lyra," he began, "why were you in that alley?" She froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Her eyes flicked to the door as if planning an escape. I was left there," she said softly. "Left?" he asked, leaning forward. She nodded. "They threw me out. When I was no longer useful." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't press her for details, but she could see anger in his eyes. Not at her, but at whoever had done this. "Who are they?" He asked anyway. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She shook her head. "If I tell you, they'll come for you too." The room went quiet, except for the faint sound of rain outside. Daniel didn't push further, but his eyes said enough. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Lyra stared at the soup. She had met humans before, but none like him. They had looked at her the way the people in the market did, like she was less. But Daniel looked at her as if she was worth saving. It frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. When she finished eating, Daniel took the tray to the door. "I'll be next door if you need anything," he said. Before leaving, he looked at her one last time. "You're safe here," he said again, and though the words felt impossible, a small part of her wanted to believe them. The morning light was soft and pale when Lyra woke. It slipped through the small window, painting thin golden lines across the wooden floor. She had not slept in a real bed for years, and her body felt both strange and rested. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. The sound was different from the night quieter. Slower, almost gentle, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The shirt Daniel had given her was still warm from her body heat. The memory of last night's food lingered in her mind. It had been so long since she had eaten until she felt full. Even now, her stomach felt settled instead of aching. It was a feeling she wasn't sure she deserved. A soft knock came at the door. "It's me," Daniel's voice said. Just like the night before, she got up quickly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders before opening the door. Daniel stood there holding a small basket. Inside were fresh rolls of bread, a slice of cheese, and a small jar of something golden. "Breakfast," he said simply, stepping inside. He placed the basket on the table and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, unsure why he kept feeding her when she had nothing to give in return, but the smell of fresh bread made her legs move without thinking. She sat down, and Daniel poured a cup of tea from a flask he had carried. The steam rose between them, curling in the air. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the jar. "Honey," Daniel replied. "Try it with the bread." She tore off a piece of bread, dipped it into the golden liquid, and took a bite. Her eyes widened at the sweetness. She had tasted sweet things before, stolen fruit, market scraps, but nothing like this. The honey seemed to melt into the bread, leaving a warmth in her mouth. Daniel smiled slightly. Watching her reaction, "You like it?" he said. More like a statement than a question. She nodded, but quickly looked down at her hands. Her instinct told her not to show too much joy. Joy made you weak, and weakness was dangerous. But something about him made it harder to keep that shield up. As they ate, Daniel spoke, his tone casual, but his eyes careful. "You can stay here for a while, Lyra," he said. She froze, the bread halfway to her mouth. "No one will throw you out," he added. Her chest tightened at his words. she wanted to believe him, but her mind whispered reminders. People lied. People changed. Promises broke. You don't know what you're saying, she muttered, her voice low. Daniel tilted his head. Then tell me. She shook her head. If I tell you, they'll come. They always come. He leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of tea. His silence wasn't heavy. It was patient. Like he was waiting for her to decide on her own. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she focused on finishing her breakfast, trying to push away the thought that someone might walk through the door at any moment. When the meal was over, Daniel took the empty cups and plates. I'll be downstairs, he said. I have some errands to run. Her eyes flicked toward the door, a ripple of panic rising. You're leaving? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Just for a while, he said. The innkeeper will be here, but don't worry, he won't bother you. She wanted to argue, to tell him not to go. But she bit her tongue when Daniel left. The room felt bigger and emptier. Lyra sat on the bed, wrapping the blanket around herself again. She listened to the faint sound of the city below, carts rolling, voices calling, doors opening and closing. But beneath those sounds, she thought, she heard something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving in the hallway outside her room. She held her breath. The steps paused outside her door. Her hands clenched the blanket tighter. Then the steps moved on, fading down the hall. She let out a slow breath, but the unease stayed. Time passed, and eventually the door opened again, but this time it was Daniel. He stepped inside, his expression unchanged, but his eyes scanning her face. Something wrong? He asked. She shook her head quickly, not wanting to seem afraid. But she knew he could see through her. Someone was in the hall, she admitted quietly. Daniel's gaze sharpened, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he closed the door and locked it. Then we'll be careful, he said, his tone calm but firm. She didn't ask what careful meant, but part of her knew. It meant someone might already know where she was. It meant the peace she felt this morning could be shattered at any moment. And yet, sitting across from Daniel with the taste of honey still on her tongue, she realized something. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. The thought scared her, as much as it comforted her. Night settled over the city like a heavy blanket. The soft glow of lanterns spilled onto the wet streets, turning puddles into pools of trembling light. Inside the small room, Lyra sat near the heater, the blanket around her shoulders. Daniel was at the table, cleaning a small knife with slow, steady movements. Neither spoke much, but the quiet between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence where words weren't needed. But still, something heavy lingered in the air. Lyra's mind kept going back to the footsteps she had heard earlier. The slow, deliberate pace. The way they had stopped outside her door. She knew that walk. She had heard it many times before. It belonged to people who didn't knock for kindness. It belonged to people who came to take, not to give. A sound from the hallway broke the stillness. Boots again. This time, heavier, closer. Her body tensed without thinking. Daniel looked at her quickly. Reading the fear in her face before he even heard it himself, he put the knife down, his hand resting on the edge of the table. Ready? The boot stopped right outside the door. A sharp knock followed. Not polite. Not patient. Open up. A deep voice ordered. Lyra's breathing quickened. She knew that voice. It was one of them. Daniel stood, moving quietly to the door. Who's asking? He said, his tone calm but carrying weight. None of your business, the man outside replied. We're looking for something. Or rather, someone. Lyra's hands gripped the blanket so hard her knuckles ached. She pressed herself against the wall, as far from the door as she could get. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She's not here, Daniel said firmly. A harsh laugh came from the other side of the door. You think we don't know who you brought in last night? You think we don't have eyes in this city? There was movement outside. More footsteps, more boots. It wasn't just one man, it was several. The sound of leather and metal shifting told Daniel they were armed. "Leave," Daniel said, his voice like stone. There was a pause, then the deep voice replied, "You can hand her over now. Human, or we can come in and take her." Lyra shut her eyes. She had seen this before, the threats, the demands, the violence that followed. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen between fear and disbelief that Daniel was still standing there, still defying them. Daniel's hand moved to his side, resting near the weapon at his belt. "You're not taking her," he said. The words were simple, but the way he spoke them made even the men outside go silent for a heartbeat. Then there was the sound of someone stepping closer to the door. "You don't know who you're dealing with, human," the voice hissed. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stayed there, a wall between them and her. The men outside murmured to each other. Finally, the deep voice spoke again. "This isn't over," he said. The boots turned. The sound of them retreating, echoing down the hallway until it faded completely. Lyra didn't move until Daniel locked the door. Only then did she breathe again, the air rushing into her lungs like she'd been underwater. She looked at him, her voice shaking. "They'll come back," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "Let them," he said. "Next time, they'll regret it." She didn't know if it was courage or recklessness, but the way he said it made her believe, for a brief moment, that maybe she wasn't doomed. Still, she couldn't shake the truth. They knew where she was now. The safety of this room, this small, fragile piece, could shatter at any time that night. She couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the walls made her tense. She stayed wrapped in the blanket, her eyes on the door. Daniel sat in the chair by the table, his weapon resting across his lap. He didn't close his eyes once. As the hours passed, she wondered why he was doing this. Why a human who owed her nothing would risk so much. She had no answer, and that uncertainty was almost as unsettling as the danger outside. But deep down, something small and stubborn whispered that maybe she was worth the risk. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't nothing after all. The morning after the threat came with a cold wind that rattled the shutters. Lyra sat on the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, her eyes heavy from a night with no real sleep. Daniel stood near the table, checking the strap of his pack. His movements were calm, but his eyes were sharper than usual. He looked like a man who had made a decision. "We're going out," he said. Her head snapped up. Out. She thought he meant leaving the city, escaping before the men from last night returned, but his next words froze her. "Out to the market." Her hands tightened around the blanket. "That's not safe," she said quietly. "They'll see me." Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "Good," he said. "Let them." The idea made her stomach twist. She had spent her life avoiding eyes, avoiding crowds, avoiding the cruel whispers that came with them. Now he wanted to walk straight into them. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They'll come for you." His voice was steady. "Then they'll have to do it in front of everyone." Minutes later, they stepped out into the morning light. The streets were already waking, stalls opening, carts rolling, voices calling out to sell goods. The smell of bread, roasted meat, and damp stone filled the air. Lyra stayed close to Daniel, her steps small and uncertain. She could feel the stairs before she even looked up. It started the same way it always did. A pause in someone's step, a sharp glance, a whispered word to a friend, a shopkeeper leaning forward to get a better look. The same ugly words she'd heard all her life floated through the air. Trash, filth. Why is she walking with a human? Daniel didn't react. He kept walking at the same pace, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder when they stopped at a fruit stand. The merchant's eyes went straight to Lyra. "We don't serve her kind," the man said flatly. Daniel picked up an apple, placed coins on the counter, and said, "You do now." The merchant's mouth opened, but whatever he was going to say died when Daniel's eyes met his. They kept walking, passing through the heart of the market. It was louder here, the air buzzing with movement and noise. But the noise shifted as more people noticed them, conversations breaking, replaced by murmurs. Some voices were mocking, others disbelieving. To Lyra, every sound felt like a stone thrown at her. But Daniel's steady presence was like a wall against the storm. Then the crowd parted slightly, and she saw them, 3 figures, standing near a stall. Even from a distance, she knew them, the way they stood, the way they looked at her like they still owned her. Her breath caught. The men from her past had found them. One of them stepped forward, a slow smirk on his face. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like our little stray has found herself a keeper." Lyra's legs felt like they might give out. Daniel stepped in front of her, blocking their view. "She's not yours," he said. The man laughed. "She's property." The word hit Lyra like a punch. She had been called it before, but hearing it now, in the middle of the market, with everyone watching, made her want to disappear. Daniel's voice rose just enough to carry over the noise. "She's under my protection now." The market grew quieter. People were stopping to watch, sensing a confrontation. The men from her past stepped closer, their smiles twisting into something darker. "Do you think you can keep her safe forever, human?" one asked. Daniel's eyes didn't leave theirs. "Long enough for you to wish you never tried." The tension was thick. Lyra could feel the crowd's eyes bouncing between Daniel, the men, and her. This was not just a fight for her safety. It was a public challenge, and the market was the stage. Finally, the men stepped back, muttering something about unfinished business. They melted into the crowd, but not before one of them gave her a look that promised they'd return. Daniel didn't chase them. Instead, he turned to her, his voice steady but softer now. "You're not hiding anymore." They finished their walk through the market, the whispers following them. Some voices carried contempt, but others, just a few, sounded curious, even approving. It was small, but it was different. For the first time, Lyra wondered if maybe Daniel's defiance could change something, not just for her, but for others like her. When they returned to the inn, she sat on the bed in silence. Her hands were still trembling, but her heart was beating with something new. Not just fear, something else, something almost like hope. She had stood in the fire and had not been burned completely, and Daniel had stood there with her. The sun had already set when Lyra sat by the small fire in Daniel's room. The flames flickered softly, casting warm light over the walls and chasing away the chill from outside. The market scene still played in her mind. The voices, the stares, the men from her past, but alongside those memories was another image. Daniel standing between her and danger. Without a second's hesitation, she pulled the blanket closer around herself. Though the warmth from the fire was enough, it wasn't the cold she was protecting herself from anymore. It was the weight of the words she had never spoken aloud, the ones that had been locked inside her for years. Daniel was sitting at the table, cleaning the small knife he always carried. His movements were calm, steady, the kind of rhythm that made her feel safer. Finally, she found her voice. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. He looked up, his eyes focused on her immediately. "I wasn't always in the alley," she began, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "They took me when I was young. I don't even remember the last time I saw my family." Her voice trembled, but she kept speaking. "They made me work in places where the air was thick with dust, places where no one came unless they wanted something broken, fixed for cheap. We slept on the floor, we ate scraps, and we were told every day that we were worthless." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, his jaw tightening with every word. Lyra's eyes drifted to the fire as she continued. If someone got sick, they were thrown out. If someone slowed down, they were beaten. When I couldn't work anymore, they put me in the street and told me to disappear. She swallowed hard. I thought I would. Silence filled the room for a moment. Daniel set the knife down and leaned forward. That was their lie, he said firmly, not your worth. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had never heard anyone say something like that to her. Her eyes stung, and before she could stop them, tears rolled down her cheeks. She turned her face away, embarrassed, but Daniel stood, crossed the small space, and knelt beside her. You survived all of that, he said, his voice steady. That makes you stronger than they'll ever be. Lyra shook her head. I don't feel strong, she whispered. He gave a faint smile. That's because real strength doesn't feel like power. He said, it feels like surviving when you shouldn't have. The fire crackled softly between them. Lyra's tears slowed, replaced by a quiet warmth she didn't quite understand. It wasn't the kind of warmth that came from fire or blankets. It was the kind that came from being seen, truly seen. For the first time, you don't have to go back, Daniel said, his voice certain. They don't own you anymore. The words echoed in her head. She had dreamed of hearing them. But now that they were real, they felt almost too big to hold. What if they come again? She asked. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. Then I'll still be here, he said simply. There was no boast in his voice, no arrogance, just a promise, solid and unshakable. The rest of the evening passed in quiet peace. Lyra ate a simple dinner. Daniel had brought bread, soup, and a small sweet cake. She savored every bite. Not because of the food itself, but because she wasn't eating it alone. When the meal was done, she leaned back in her chair, feeling something she had almost forgotten existed. Dignity. It was in the way Daniel spoke to her as an equal. It was in the way he didn't flinch at her scars or her past. It was in the way he had walked through the market with her in full view of everyone for years. She had believed that dignity was something people like her were not allowed to have. Now, she knew that was a lie. As the fire burned low, Daniel handed her the coat he had first given her in the alley. She ran her fingers over the fabric, remembering how it had felt in that cold, wet night. It had been the first touch of warmth in years. She held it close again, but now it meant something more. It was no longer just a shield from the cold. It was proof that someone had seen her and chosen to help. Thank you, she said. Her voice steady this time. Daniel nodded once. You don't need to thank me, he replied. But I will, she said, because you gave me more than warmth. You gave me back myself. Outside, the wind howled through the streets. But inside the small room, the fire's glow held steady. Lyra sat in that light, wrapped in the coat. Her head high. For the first time in years, she was still afraid of what might come, but now she wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference.